Hello, I'm Rosalind Stone, and I lead the Semantric sessions with Dr. Rhiannon Crane. And we have reason to believe that what we are about to share with you today is what you would really call a podcast. And our guest on this podcast is Dennis Walker. Dennis is the creator of Mycobabble, which is the leading mushroom media platform in the world, and he speaks internationally at conferences and produces investigative journalism with titles like The Psychedelic Renaissance is cancelled after it's revealed to be pure colonialism. So we are going to be speaking to Dennis today about childhood and classroom dynamics and business trips and probably a little bit of satire as well. I think if we kind of kick off, because I know you've been a teacher and also obviously been a child, and I am wondering about archetypes and the classroom and what you think the kind of gestation period in the classroom does to one's sense of who one is as an archetype and archetypes in general, and maybe how that has fed into your reading of the psychedelic scene and the archetypes that you find in it today.
Totally. Great question. Hi, I'm Dennis. First of all, hello, everyone. And yes, I taught at a very unique school. It was a project-based learning school. It was kind of a hippie school. So I think that we had a lot of free reign and we had a lot of artistic license, which is one of the reasons I loved teaching there and being a part of it. It was in San Diego. It was called High Tech High. And we didn't have a formal curriculum. So like as a child, you mentioned I was in fact a child. I went to public school, and I think that there is a very real sense of indoctrination and having creativity bred out of you in a lot of ways. And when I reflect back upon my schooling experience, it was much more learning how to pay attention, learning how to be quiet, learning how to behave in a group, things like that. There were the occasional inspiring teachers who really made me feel like I was valued and my creative sense mattered to the world. But I would say that was the exception rather than the rule. So fast forward to when I was a high school teacher, as far as getting to observe the different archetypes, I noticed a very large difference between more public education in the United States and this kind of hippie project-based learning style of pedagogy where everyone was encouraged to be creative and where everybody was encouraged essentially to think like a child, right? And that's something that I hope that more people get to experience in the future with education. So as far as like precise archetypes, definitely had a lot of tricksters in my class, had a lot of people who were lovable and affable, yet occasionally malevolent, it felt like. And it's tough to be a high school teacher. You know, I had 14-year-olds in my class and I was like 25. So there wasn't a huge age gap there. And one semester I had juniors. So it was like a 7-year age gap between us. And it was quite difficult for me to be kind of the authoritarian. So I backed off of that and I kind of let people do whatever they want. But end of the story is I think that free reign is good in the classroom, but you also need to have a soft measure of authority, and that's a slippery slope.
Well, were you teaching a particular subject then, or was it not quite organized like that?
It was multimedia production. So I had kind of honestly, the best subject, I think. We were watching YouTube videos and making documentaries, and every kid had a MacBook, which was pretty rare, you know, even for these days. So multimedia production. And then I taught one semester of biology, which I had no business doing. And I learned very much. You don't have to know, everything. You just have to know a little bit more than the kids for that day.
Well, that sounds like such a kind of perfect hybridization of what you've gone on to create now, because I guess there's the biological understanding of what's going on with the mushrooms, and different people you interview will be bringing that. And then also, I love this phrase that you used, I think maybe in your BC write-up, the information ecosystem. And it sounds like what you were teaching the kids then would have really fed into this understanding of all of these different kind of news outlets and organisms that you're commenting on now and how they fit together. Do you feel like it was quite a seamless progression in some ways?
In some ways, for sure. Yeah. I think the media literacy component of the modern world is super important and super undervalued. Like everything we're doing is essentially bottlenecked through an online forum or online medium, be it the timeline or your email or whatever. But I think for many people, as we try to figure out what's going on in the world, like that's your medium of communication now is this information ecosystem. And that extends to the psychedelic space where there's a lot of, even at like what I would call like higher levels, like in the quote, emerging psychedelic industry and, these different the concerns that the information ecosystem sometimes is kind of haywire and like different stakeholders have different agreements of what a fact is. And that's something that I think is fascinating. And we saw that recently in Denver. We saw, different stakeholders with different perspectives about how psychedelics should be mainstreamed, essentially going head to head. And just to quickly put a bow on top of this thought, I was at the Mushroom Summit, which was a co-located conference before psychedelic science. And there were a number of very established, entrenched stakeholders representing massive businesses at that Mushroom Summit who had open debates and disagreements about the science around certain aspects of the mushroom industry and mushrooms. So it shows that even in 2023, we still have a lot of competing ideologies and narratives. And I think that's mapped out onto the information ecosystem. And it becomes super overwhelming for people to try to navigate that.
Is that how you find yourself in this kind of jester position then?
I just like doing it. It's improv. It's something that I started doing one day, and I realized there's a lot of value to investing in cultivating a sense of humor. I don't think that I've always had it. Like, I've definitely had a kind of comical streak. I won class clown going back to high school, and I was always kind of like on the periphery of the in crowd is how I describe it. Like, I was kind of the funny guy who hung out with the cool guys or cool people. So I suppose I sort of internalized that identity, but I realized like through my work with Mycopreneur and getting more involved in this psychedelic space, if you will, that there was really a short supply of humor, it feels like. And you've been to some of the conferences and conventions. I think Breaking Convention is quite a special one for a lot of reasons, but a number of the ones I went to in the US last year were suspiciously devoid of humor. It was a lot of like really intense industry and business and research. And while I think those aspects have their place, like where's the merry prankster energy, right? Where's this kind of oddball, trickster, eccentric, psychedelic energy?
Do you think there's kind of a natural dourness that comes with maybe the need to prove through science the medicinal benefits and the financial value of these substances? Do you think that might be where it's coming from, or do you think there's something deeper going on in the lack of inherent comedy in the space already? Like, where's that coming from?
Yeah, that's a big one that you just named. I'm sure that's what it is, that there's a sense of wanting to make psychedelics marketable and palatable to a mainstream audience. And with that comes a sense of scrutiny, I think, in a sense of almost sterilization. And I'm not opposed to that, but I don't think that we should mainstream and medicalize psychedelics at the expense of these other domains where they're quite interesting. And, they seem to have historically brought out more eccentric and, a little bit more colorful aspects of people. Like we think about not just the 1960s, but going back as far as you want, that psychedelics have sort of always had this kind of humorous element to them, I fully believe. And I have a lot of examples in my own life that I can speak to as far as that goes.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you feel the Breaking Convention is quite a special one. Do you what's your perception of the British psychedelic community, as opposed to the US community?
Yeah, I was really tickled to have been there, and I met a lot of wonderful people. A few of our mutual friends I already knew, Darren LeBaron. I think he typifies a lot of what makes a convention like Breaking Convention special. And that this is somebody who's fully in his own lane. Like there's no other Darren Springer. And I think I could say that about a bunch of different people I met at Breaking Convention. I met someone named Fluffy, who you may or may not be familiar with, and he organizes shows. And like, it was so cool to be having breakfast every morning with Fluffy, who organizes psytrance festivals and shows on my left. And then on my right is the director of research at Imperial College London, right? it's that kind of dynamic. And I think that in the United States, the conventions I went to skew heavily towards the more research, academic legitimacy. And I do think that a huge part of that is that's where maybe there's more perceived marketability and more of like a pharmaceutical lens. And you start to get bipartisan political support when you take it from that angle. So I think that's definitely part of it. But like, I don't want to lose the other kind of like the music organizers and the psytrance DJs and the comedians and the stilt walkers. Like those are all vital contributors to the world of psychedelics as far as I'm concerned.
It's a really interesting position, I guess, that you come into these worlds from as well, because you're being invited as a satirist. And I feel like that came out a lot in your introductions at Psychedelic Science, this idea of people saying to you, please roast us and please roast my publication, please roast my organization. So you're allowed to step into these spaces and like kind of explore the contrasts between what's going on at Breaking Convention and Psychedelic Science and the Mushroom Conference you just mentioned, and call out these differences, but in a way that needs to remain somewhat palatable, I guess, to the organizers, because that's what you've been invited there to do. And I'm just wondering, does that lead to different types of satirization to kind of get it right for each situation? And yeah, how do you go about saying what you really feel while remaining within the bounds of what you've been invited to do?
Wonderful, wonderful question. Wonderful inquiry. I call it an act of diplomacy. I think that diplomacy is a forgotten art, and it really means doing your due diligence. I think that's where good satire has a place in this emerging space, or whatever you want to call it. Like some people call it psychedelic industry, the psychedelic renaissance. Psychedelics, like any way you slice it, there's a lot of people talking about psychedelics. There's a lot of different interests. One of my takeaways from the last conference you mentioned, Psychedelic Science, is that the word psychedelics and the concept of psychedelics means so many different things to so many different people, right? I think that when you just say, there's a psychedelic conference, it's like, well, if you're talking to one person, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's for, my friends who are Navy veterans who are finding healing with this. Somebody else will think, oh, that's the merry prankster stuff, LSD. Somebody else is going to think it's ketamine or MDMA. So like, it's really a loaded word and a loaded term. And as far as approaching these opportunities and these invitations, I think it's about doing your due diligence and kind of studying and making informed observations and commentary. And that's something that I lean heavily into improv to do, where I study when I, talk to people and gather information. I kind of figure out like, what are the through lines? What are the touch points? What's important to these people or to this organization? And try to make inside jokes. And I think that's where satire has a lot of value. Like if you can roast, quote, quote, a company, but you're also showing that you know a lot about the company and their general situation, I think there's value in that. And even if you occasionally stick a foot over the line maybe and say something that is truly a little bit inflammatory, that can be forgiven in the context of just the broader arc of doing your due diligence and showing respect and showing that you're interested in what that company or organization is doing.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into this idea that like to satirize something is to dismiss it, when I think it's the exact opposite, because it really takes knowledge to do it, and you're making a bigger statement. And yeah, no, great work.
Thanks. Also, I got to say that the Brits have some of the best satirists in history. And as an American, like I'm a huge Sacha Baron Cohen fan, one of the best to ever do it. I think about the original Office and Ricky Gervais, right? And like, those are two that immediately come to mind. Yeah. The Office. Okay, The Office. And Rowan Atkinson, I believe was his name, Mr. Bean. I remember when the Mr. Bean craze swept the United States, and I probably was in 3rd or 4th grade, and everybody was talking about Mr. Bean. And also that idea of physical comedy, I think, is really important. That's like, I realized like I'm not that funny on podcasts because a lot of the comedy I do is like very physical. It's like kind of acting a certain way. Like I had this kind of monkey walk that I would do a lot when I first started making the satire. And like a lot of people, I don't know what, maybe they don't speak English. I have friends and fans in different countries, but they could understand the monkey walk and the physicality and when I wear a Speedo and things like that and run around. So I think that's one angle too that's interesting, is like the physicality And I learned some of that from watching Mr. Bean and from watching British comedy.
Oh my God, nothing freaks me out more than the idea of having to do stand-up, to have to stand somewhere alone and be funny. I honestly, I, I, what do you think's behind the myth that British people think that Americans don't really get irony? What do you think is behind that whole cliche?
It's a great question. I think there are a lot of different factions and demographics of American people. And there are probably, like, if you're talking about the Bible Belt and the heartland, it's probably going to miss. I think that, I grew up in California, and we like to think of ourselves as being a little bit more cultured and, reading international publications and things like that. So I would say that depends who you're asking and, what demographic you're talking about. But there definitely is even within the US, there's many different sort of cosmologies and ways of looking at the world. And irony might be lost on a lot of us over here. But I'd like to say that Californians, I don't know, maybe we're the coastal elites or something, but like we have a general sense of irony.
I've been told off for my like delivery style sometimes, where it's like, no, like you got to change your voice if you're saying something sarcastic. I'm like, no, that's exactly what you don't do. It's funnier if you don't. And I've had that discussion with people from across the pond, but
I'll pick up on it when I hear it, and I'll give you some feedback if I have any.
We did speak to you, and I noticed someone who's doing something that might have quite an interesting layer of irony recently. So I noticed your interview with Elon Musk in Instagram stories, and I like how dramatically that was cut. But one of the things that I was curious about is, did you talk about the cage fight? And how do you feel about the metaphoricalism of, well, obviously Elon Musk is Twitter essentially, and then Mark Zuckerberg is Facebook, and Facebook is obviously owned by a company called Meta. But do you think they're being meta, or do you think that there's this layer that is just kind of up for grabs to see to this idea of Twitter and Facebook going head to head? And yeah, how does that fit into your cosmology, and what did he have to say about it if you spoke to him about it?
Well, we didn't talk about that, but I'll tell you that Americans, United States people love our wrestling, WWF, WWE. We love our sort of staged theatrical throwdowns. And for my money, that's kind of what's going on. I don't know that there's any actual animosity between these tech ringleaders, but I think that sort of feud drives engagement for both of them. And I suppose there's a lot of that which happens in the political theater as well, where we have very starkly divided left and right. And from my perspective, those two camps are often on the same team. It's like essentially a class divide, but we have, a lot of political turmoil, and I think that extends to the business landscape. And it's quite interesting to watch. But one thing's for sure, they've got everybody talking about both of their products.
Do you feel like there's a particular platform that helps you get your message across more purely than some of the other platforms? Or do you feel like it's always got to be pasteurized in some way? And then also, how do you think that kind of influence of the platforms themselves shows up in the psychedelic discourse as a whole?
For me, it was Instagram, and really kind of where I'm at now is complete. I call it like accidentally on purpose. Like I've been working in the creative industries and as a writer and a artist for many years. And it's really only in the last like year and a half, 2 years, I've had any kind of measurable success. And it was the Instagram Reels. Like, I don't know what compelled me to make an Instagram Reel, a short video. I have a background in video production. I have a degree in media, and I have a company that my wife and I run. So I'm no stranger to producing video, but like I had never thought about doing video on Instagram. And I did one day, and it was very well received, and it boosted engagement. And I started getting more listeners to the podcast. And then I kind of, by extension of that, decided to do comedy one day. And it was never like this process, like I'm going to do comedy. It was more just like I grabbed my phone, I shot a quick improv comedy video, and that was very well received. And that sort of started to tell me that there's a demand for this, and I think it's a combination of things. I think it was being at the right place at the right time, sort of luck, but also that I have a knack for it. Like I have a sort of maybe deadpan, ironic delivery that, I'm a fan of people like Will Ferrell and Danny McBride and a number of other comedians, Sacha Baron Cohen, I mentioned. So there's this sense of like saying something really absurd and ridiculous, deadpan with a straight face, that I think that's sort of like one of the gifts that I have that's enabled me to have more opportunities. And, once you start to recognize that, it's really like anything. Like if you've launched your platform, you're like, what's working? Let me do more of that and less of this other stuff that's not working. It is the connection with people that I do it for. And I have to remind myself sometimes when I'm like, why am I doing this? It's like, I really value the community more so than an audience, like having a community. And that's what I want to invest in. And I hope to get to a point where I'm not constantly spending my days online, but I also value to be able to sort of have this opportunity and to have a community and an audience. And, that's something that I want to do.
And has your sense of who your audience is changed and kind of diversified as time has gone on? Because in the beginning, it sounds as though you were non-ironically bringing people together to talk about mushroom businesses. Is that right? And then the sense of a need to satirize something grew quite organically as the movement grew. So yeah, I'm curious about how that's changed.
Totally. Like it's still a very serious business podcast. And I've had people who have, venture funds and major roles be like, why don't you just only do comedy? Like, why do you do both of them? And I think my answer is because I think having the more serious journalistic sort of platform, it gives me a little bit wider berth too. When people see me doing the satire, they're like, oh, that's part of it. It's not the whole kit and caboodle. So I think, like, for example, if I've had this situation arise a handful of times, where like if I satirize a particular individual or company, then I can invite them on the podcast and we have like an honest, serious conversation. And it sort of gives it a little bit more of that diplomatic flair to be like, no, I'm really interested in what you're doing. At the end of the day, I think satire is a really powerful tool. It's a Trojan horse, I like to call it. And, I discussed this at Psychedelic Science and Breaking Convention, but like, if you critique someone or an organization or whatever it is, and you're kind of like attacking them, if you will, or critiquing them, that automatically shuts down a lot of opportunities for reconciliation or growth. Like your brain will light up and go into defense mode if somebody is criticizing you. But with satire, if it's funny, it seems to be kind of this like free pass with like, that's funny. I do look like that sometimes. And I look to platforms like South Park, The Onion, a handful of others who are quite extreme. Like if you look at the lampooning and the satire that they're doing, it's definitely pretty barbed and pretty over the top. And I find like that's sort of a boundary. Like, well, those are successful, marketable, well-received products, and they also happen to lampoon a lot of public figures.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the beauty of well, certainly South Park, that no one escapes, like everyone is a potential target. And I really have to admit that when you were talking about micropreneur, I was like, business bro, business bro.
And then I guess that.
And that was really, really, really pleasantly surprised. I mean, it would have been great, and if that's what you were, and I would have been nice, and would have had a great conversation. But I was somewhat relieved by that. That's my own prejudice coming out.
Well, I guess the thing that's really beautiful about what a lot of your content does is it kind of lampoons the whole belief systems that these ideas and organizations are birthed into. So like one title that I noticed that I really liked recently was Compass Pathways announces that they're getting closer to maybe hopefully doing what indigenous cultures have been doing for thousands of years. And I just thought it's just so brilliant how many kind of big topics that article sends up, like the healthcare system that's already been failing tens of millions of Americans. And like, you can't really be angry, I think, if you're any of the people in that article or organizations about the way that you've discussed it, because it's just kind of, it's done a very South Park thing of kind of critiquing broader world phenomena that everyone minds about. So is that something that you consciously do with those? Well, I guess you're parodying, not parodying, but working with the onion as a kind of yardstick, then that must come quite naturally. Do you sometimes feel like you need to go out on a limb with a topic because it hasn't been done before, but you just really need to address that topic?
Definitely 100%. I like to push the envelope. I think that there's been a period, especially in the United States, where people have been walking on eggshells because of cancel culture. And like, that's a very loaded topic, and I don't have strong opinions one way or the other about a lot of like political or social ideologies, to be honest. But like this idea of like people being very guarded and fearful of what they can say, I think has been taken a little bit too far and actually been detrimental to advancing a lot of good dialogue and fostering good dialogue. So I think that, like, first of all, everyone can agree that you should be able to satirize billionaires and the ultra wealthy. Like, that's such low hanging fruit. I'm thinking like if Elon Musk or Christian Angermeyer or one of these people get upset that some dude, lower middle class dude on Instagram was making fun of them, like that's a real big problem, I think, with them, right? So I think satirizing the wealthy and punching up is one aspect of satire that I lean into. Is like you should be allowed to make fun of the prevailing political party, and that's the culture I was raised in, that like you're allowed to have your perspectives and you're allowed to voice them, and like especially if it's done in an intelligent way. I think that's like the mark too. Like if you're just out there crusading and being angry and saying nasty things, that's one thing. But like if you're couching it and like sort of high art, if you will, I think that you can get away with a lot, and punching up is a huge part of that. And I'll continue to make fun of Elon Musk and Christian Angermeyer and the president of the United States and so on and so forth.
Good.
I think I answered your question. Yeah.
Good.
Very much so. And I guess also within that, there's what their companies and their business aims are and what they're trying to do. And I guess that obviously making fun of a person and kind of the persona that they're putting across is one thing. But I really, really liked your description of that maps the kind of Gabriel Garcia Marquez style kind of traveling circus of all the companies. And then I'm wondering within that, were there any that you like would be tempted to kind of do something on specifically, or kind of any strains of what's being sold, what's being marketed that you like really want to address?
Yeah, so there are so many walking plot lines and punchlines, I think, just in the very absurd concept of like the commercialization of psychedelics. And I find a lot of value in being able to have this platform to call these things out. But like one example, I don't remember the name of the company, but they had like these kits you could take when you've taken ecstasy or MDMA, and they have like pop rocks. And it was just, he's like, you ever tried pop rocks when you're on MDMA? And I'm like, that's kind of an amazing, like, that's your niche that you found. Was that like, I'm going to supply ravers with pop rock candy, and like, I think that's a kind of an oversimplification. But yes, there were a number of other ones. And I actually got to satirize a bunch of the exhibitors with a camera crew. It was amazing. Maps gave me multiple camera people and an audio guy and a microphone. And I went around and just kind of like leaned into this improv satirical element. And I realized like, that's what I want to do. Like Rianne said earlier, she's terrified of going on stage and doing stand-up comedy. I love that shit. And I realized like, I'm a lot more quiet and awkward when I'm off stage, when like the spotlight comes on and the camera turns on. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just, I suffer from this like deplorable excess of personality and like a desire for attention because I didn't get enough attention as a child, which is not true. But that's sort of like what kicks in. It's like, oh, I love this. And so that was something that actually happened, is that I took the microphone around and interviewed people. I interviewed Hamilton Morris, and I had quite an awkward interview with him where he just wasn't very responsive. And then I just kept kind of like gently prodding and sort of being sarcastic. And at a certain point, I think he realized, like at first he thought it was a serious interview. And then he goes, is that sarcasm? And he has just like this really like dry, and I was like, yeah, bro. And then he got it. And so that was like a really special experience for me to get that opportunity. And I hope that footage does come out. So Maps, if you're listening, Devin, if you're listening, show the people that footage, dog. Let me get it.
No, it's beautiful because it's particularly hard for British people to do the kind of like interview persona. You know, like if I try to do an introduction like, "Hey guys, why don't you check out?" Like it's ridiculous. And I think it's really disarming, yeah, when you can step out of that.
I think this can go back. I just want to mention to like me as a high school teacher, I'm used to kind of being up in front of a bunch of people who don't really care what I have to say. And you have to like find a way to be entertaining and engaging. And there was like a lot of days there where I'd show up and I'd just be like, I feel like I've been up here for 2 hours and we're 10 minutes into class and I have the rest of the day to go. So you kind of learn to roll with it, you know, it's
Yeah.
certainly not for everyone. Absolutely not. But like it, you know, I have that sort of aspect to me.
I wanted to ask you about your experiences with psychedelics. If psychedelics are a sort of creative tool in your satire, your satirical.
100%. 100%. Yeah. I am a myconaut, might be one word. I've long been very interested in mushrooms and in high dose solo mushroom experiences. And this also plays into a lot of my interests in language too, which I imagine it does for you, the psychedelic experience and the connection to language. And quite literally, my first high dose mushroom experience that I had when I was 18 years old, I saw hieroglyphics. And I think a lot of people have had this experience or, you know, read about it. And it was fascinating. And of course, then I followed the work of Terence McKenna and a lot of these very well-known thinkers. And I just couldn't believe. I remember seeing these hieroglyphics streaming down the walls of my bedroom. And that kind of flipped the script on a lot of the way that I saw the world, because I was like, first of all, what is this? Second of all, this is really intelligent is what it felt like. Like, I don't feel like I'm doing a drug right now or I'm under the influence. Something really intelligent and natural is happening right now. And I want to learn more about it. So absolutely.
Did you paint the wall behind you?
My wife painted this studio and it's
Look-
quite a good look. Yeah.
Looks like the hieroglyphics that you were mentioning.
It's quite trippy, yes. And I have like black and white shirts that play into it. So it's fun. But I've got like a green screen over here. And then the rest of the room is hieroglyphics and just like memorabilia. And, but yeah, I'm a psychonaut for sure. I have been for a long time. And I've learned to sort of integrate it in a functional way and creative. I use them creatively for sure. Like I often tell people, we didn't have a quote psychedelic industry back in my day. We had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to buy our psychedelics. You know, what we did have was like the creative arts. If you had a psychedelic experience, you tended to gravitate towards playing music or becoming a poet and like, you know, pursuing that. That's what we had. And I think that's where a lot of the psychedelic quote legacy and lineage of years past has been passed down. We think about all the great artists in the West in the 60s, but of course, long before then in many other cultures, there is very much like a creative edge to it in my own experience.
Yeah, I think they have such a potential to kind of balance the excesses of like Western education, like you say, the kind of orthodox Western education that isn't very creative, and that if you're doing art or music, you're graded, you know, and it's
Yeah, this really kind of weird Cartesian quantifying thing
yeah,
goes on.
that makes you just think, oh, is this good enough? Like, oh, I'm so shit at this.
The idea that there could be a mark scheme for looking at a piece of art or something, yeah, like it's really bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a hard time with that because I played in bands and wanted to be a professional musician, as many of us do. And it is quite strange to like navigate that of like, it has to be perfect and it has to be marketable. And like, I'm sure you've both experienced this in different degrees where it's like, that's not why I got started doing this, you know? Like, so at a certain point, you just kind of say, I'm going to keep doing my thing. And again, this brings it back to like breaking convention. I feel like there's a lot of oddballs I met there who are just career artists and eccentric people. And like, it doesn't matter if they have a top 40 hit on the radio or if they're, you know, have a television show or whatever. They're still doing art professionally, full time, in whatever capacity that is. That's super inspiring. I think that as a young person, like there is a tendency to get carried away with like Oh no, I'm not playing Glastonbury and I'm not, selling a
Yeah.
bunch of records. I'm failed as an artist. It's like,
Yes.
really? I don't know about that. Like maybe that whole system is not built for real art. Maybe it's something else.
And even to go back to what you said about the kind of it has to be perfect, I think that we've both talked a lot about this because Rianne produces music and I write a lot of creative writing. And this sense of it has to be perfect to kind of come out of the pen or come into being in the first place can be so entrapping. Do you have ways that you get past that in order to make sure that you do make something rather than kind of getting stuck on what it could be?
Yeah, it's so good to bomb, honestly, to suck at something. And I think that that's where improv comes in. And like, that's where also pushing your comfort zone, I think is really important. Like, if you do want to grow, you got to push the comfort zone. And I've signed up for a few stand-up gigs that, I'm like, hey, I'll do stand-up. I would love to do it. And then I'll get there and I'll be like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And that happened in Denver. I went to a party that I was going to perform at, and there were like 400 people there. And I looked at the stage and I looked at the crowd and I thought, holy guacamole, I'm totally unprepared for this. I'm going to get up there. It's going to be horrible. And I don't think I did great, to be honest. I think it was like mediocre, but it was a really powerful learning experience and like being up there. And then you get a taste of it for the next time. So I think that being okay bombing or sucking and just putting it out and kind of like getting rid of that inner critic. Obviously, the inner critic is there for a reason. And like, you want to generally put out good work. But I think that's where like doing it and going forward and getting honest feedback from people. Like, if you make a valid and honest attempt and put yourself out there, sure, somebody might laugh at you, but more likely you're going to get some honest, constructive feedback. And it's probably going to be better than you thought it was.
And also, most people aren't paying 100% attention all the time, especially if it's music or whatever. They're like talking to their friends or they're thinking about things, like they're only like partially tuned in anyway.
Yeah, we are our own worst critics for sure, for sure. So like, how can you minimize or mitigate that and like entertain it occasionally? But I think that doing it actually, and like, you're doing the podcast, we're doing this right now. Like that's a real thing right now that we're doing, as opposed to like sitting around and thinking, how would that be? Or how would that go? Like there's real value to just like putting yourself out there and trying it and suck at something. I think like when I started my podcast, it was terrible. And I think anybody who has a success, good creative project, or they'll tell you that like, I was terrible, but you just make a deal with yourself to keep going. And I think you have to do it from that place of authenticity that you want to do it. You're not trying to go for metrics, or you're not trying to impress someone. Like you're doing it because you want to do it. And if you can find a way to like bring that authenticity out, that's what's going to make a project shine from my perspective.
We're really glad we can ask you this. Actually, it might be the same thing. Why do people do podcasts? Why are we doing this podcast right now? Why do you have a podcast? Like, we kind of instinctively felt like it was a thing that we ought to do with Semantrics to talk to people. But
are we doing a podcast? Are we doing a podcast?
Well, we're having a conversation. He's called it a podcast. He knows about podcasts. But yeah,
we're using Riverside. I thought that's exclusively a podcasting platform. Yeah, I think it's about the dialogue and it's about networking, I think. And like, I think networking sort of has this like Silicon Valley bro vibe to it, but it's not that. It's just connecting with people and having this recorded conversation and putting it out, sharing it with other people. It ends up becoming kind of nebulous and growing. And like, this happens all the time with my podcast, where you have a conversation with someone and then you put it out there and then someone wants to become part of that and they want to respond to something they heard. And you're just kind of like growing out organically. So I think that's the real value to it, is like, it's networking, it's getting to know people. And like, how often do we get to have focused 1-on-2 or 2-on-1 conversations like this, with new people who that's my dog. You said that you've got your pup there, but my dog Rupert, nice British name, is acting a fool back there. So please be kind.
Rupert, not the time.
He's got such a wonderful resounding echo.
Yes. Why do you do the podcast though? Or why do you do Semantrics, can I ask?
Wait. Just while we're on this, just really quickly. No, actually. It can wait. You see, I told you we're not good at this.
You're great at it.
Where can our 8 listeners find you? How can they look you up?
Yeah, hit me up. Mycopreneur. It's Mycopreneur. I'm glad I got that in the first try. And I'm active on Instagram and all the socials. You could probably even find me on Yahoo if you want. I'm all over the web. And I love to meet people and entertain collaborations and opportunities and conversations. So please do reach out to me.
And in that vein, actually, I guess, are there any comedians or kind of just general public figures that you wish would be talking about psychedelics that haven't talked about psychedelics yet, or anyone who has recently where you've been like, yes, finally there was a psychedelic thing from that person?
I think we're going to see a lot more of it really soon. And like, shout out to the Good Trip Studios team. If anybody's seen Good Trip on Netflix, which is interviewing a lot of public figures and celebrities about their psychedelic use. They had Anthony Bourdain in the first season and a ton of other people. I think Paul McCartney maybe in the second season. I'm not actually sure about that. But Diplo, I'm a fan of Diplo's, and he's been advocating for psychedelics and using them creatively. Danny McBride, I'm a huge fan of Danny's, and that's kind of like one of my secret sauce. I would say that his work has had as profound an impact on me as anybody else, probably more so than them, and he's actively doing it. So, and what I liked about them is I could gush about them all day, but they're very small town people who have the same production and creative team they went to college with in the South, who are now making major motion pictures in Hollywood. And I think that's really special to have like that creative chemistry. And I feel like an outsider, like it's still, and psychedelics feel like an outsider. So like, it's really cool when someone like Danny McBride and Jody Hill, or the Flaming Lips is another example, a huge fan of theirs, an outsider makes it into the inside. I think that's a really special thing. And that's what I want to do. Like, I'm not comfortable like with the in crowd, but like, I really like their parties and, being around them for getting to draw more satirical plot lines from them.
Yeah. Do you ever sort of miss when it was a bit more niche, when it was like...
I totally do. You know what? I often talk about that too. Like, I was eating low doses of mushrooms at parties and in social scenarios pretty frequently for a long time. And it was not a thing. It was like my little secret. Like, I'd eat a half gram of mushrooms before a wedding because like, I love a wedding. It's super fun. You go, it's just, you don't have to make it a big deal. And it was pretty awesome for like a good decade there where I felt like, it wasn't very common, wasn't very ubiquitous. And I kind of always had them around me. And I felt like this is a substance, and I almost call it like a relationship that works well for me. And now it's just like a huge thing. And I think there's a lot of value too, that it's mainstreaming, but I also have a lot of reservations about the way people maybe come to it without doing their own due diligence. And I have a lot of thoughts on that. That could be a whole other podcast. But like, for example, when I got interested in mushrooms and psychedelics, like I did a lot of research. I read a lot of books. I went on Arrowhead. I was careful. I wasn't mixing. I was doing them kind of in solo intentional settings. So now, like, having been a high school teacher, been around a lot of these, it just concerns me a little bit when it's just like, you have your phone out and you're at a festival and you're mixing 3 substances. And then it's like, I question, not to say that I discourage recreational psychedelic use, but like, end of rant, like, I think it's really valuable to learn how you work with them one-on-one and to build a personal and authentic and direct relationship. But that's just my take.
What was the drugs education like at High Tech High?
There was none. I was in, I guess. And it's something that I'm inspired to continue to develop educational curriculums around drugs. And I have some ongoing and active collaborations in that regard forthcoming. But we had DARE, that's what I grew up with. You've probably heard of like DARE to resist drugs and alcohol. And it's just an abject failure. And in fact, it taught many of us to go out and look for drugs. Like, nobody was talking about LSD before the cop came in and started telling you would see cartoon characters if you took this thing. But they don't teach you any real valuable harm reduction information or anything. They just kind of like tell you it's this cognitive dissonance where you're like, they say no to all drugs. They're all bad. And then you hear from your neighbors and your friends that like drugs are amazing. And I think the reality is it's somewhere in the middle. Like, they can be super amazing, but like, of course there are risks involved. And like, how can you have a credible conversation with people that's not fear mongering, but also not sidetracked by too much hype? Because I think there is a lot of hype too about like this is going to solve your depression. Like that's a gross, drastic oversimplification and probably not accurate. So I think we got to find sweet, sensible kind of middle ground, if you will. And that did not exist at high tech.
The cultural red tape's a really interesting one. I was briefly involved with setting up a group called Drugs and Me, which is dedicated to harm reduction information and providing it in university context. And it sounds like you encountered a similar kind of thing where it becomes almost weirder to talk about drugs than it is to take them. So you've got this kind of carnival of ways that people are finding altered states of consciousness, but then actually having a real conversation about what's going on is somehow kind of culturally off limits or kind of behind some kind of weird wall.
We have a lot of cultural issues in the States, and I would say that having vulnerable and informed conversations around drugs is a huge problem right now. So I hope to be able to start credibly addressing that. And I want to give a shout out every time I can. I give a shout out to Rana Hashimi. She has a program called No Drugs, KNOW Drugs, and has been running pilot education curriculums in Oakland public schools, like in inner city schools, where there's a harm reduction lens, where they're talking about her own drug experiences and talking about like data-driven, trauma-informed education and pedagogy around drugs, because DARE is still active in like 75% of US school districts. So it's been largely recognized as an abject failure, yet there's no clear successor to them. So I think that's a huge opportunity and, a huge problem, which means there's a huge opportunity there as well.
Speaking of not selling or demonizing them, are there any substances that you really don't get along with that you just cannot?
I loved cocaine for a while, and that was a long time ago. And I think that I'm good on it now, but like, that's one that still pops up every now and then where I'm like, ooh, like I spoke with Jonathan Ott, who you're probably familiar with at Breaking Convention, and, a number of other people love it. And he said, he's like, it's the best medicine. I'm like, it would be really interesting to explore that angle, but that's not really the experiences I had. I didn't really have any guardrails when I first, discovered it, but it's a fascinating substance. I've never really gotten into opiates, which I feel personally fortunate for, but I also know a lot of people value and have healthy relationships with them. So I think that's another loaded subject, but I feel quite grateful knowing myself that that's not ever something that I got into, having had a roommate who overdosed and died, and, know multiple people, as I'm sure many of us do. It was typically opiates and no other drug that would, besides alcohol, I guess, that would kind of pose a lethal threat to people. And so again, I'm not an expert on these subjects, but those two. And then as far as like things that I would love to do some good MDMA again. It's been honestly like 10 years. I've only tried it a handful of times. Same with ketamine. I've only tried it a handful of times. Had like favorable experiences, I'd say. But, for me, I was always into like classic psychedelics, like DMT. Mushrooms were kind of the easiest to get my hands on, but like mushrooms check a lot of boxes for me. I think they can be really deep and introspective, but they can also be really fun. Like if you take them from my own perspective, take them in a small dose, I find them to be quite sociable. Take a gram or 2 grams of mushrooms. I love that in a recreational party setting. But again, I take responsibility for my own experiences. I'm not advocating for anyone to break any laws.
I find that I get nausea and I'm just in tears somewhere, just crying. So
you're the sensitive artist type, perhaps.
Yeah, I spent most of the ICPR after party throwing up into a bin while watching one dance, and my intention had been I really want to forget about everything else and just be here with my friends. So I kind of was, but I was just by a bin at the side. But
nothing brings you into the present, like vomiting.
Yeah, that is also true.
Authentic relating.
And I guess kind of getting your inner you out as well. Do you feel like different types of mushrooms bring out different feelings and kinds of creativity versus sociability for you? Do you get on with some types better than others?
No, I honestly think maybe that's a personal thing, but like there's a lot of hype around that. And I find the same with cannabis, to be honest. Like it doesn't really matter to me if it's an indica or a sativa or whatever. Like I'm getting stoned, right? Like if I'm taking even a small amount. And I think it's the same with mushrooms. And I also attribute that to having 17 or 18 years of experience with them now, where again, I feel like when you build a personal relationship with that, like you can feel it when it's coming on. And that's one of the things that kind of concerns me about like when people get into psychedelics and like in recreational settings for the first time, there's a lot of groupthink that happens. I think there's a lot of like group dynamic, and it's like, we're feeling this way and we're feeling that way. And I think like that could be good if you know your own personality and self and how you respond to whatever substance going into that, right? And like not letting that suggestibility transfer onto you. And I think that collectively, that's something I'd like to emphasize to people too, is I think that mushrooms can be a very idiosyncratic thing. It's like pure idiosyncrasy. Like whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, tune into that and get to know that. That's really valuable. And then you can connect to the broader ecosystem. But that's just kind of my own, like my own old fart opinion, I suppose.
Well, it's like run with the non-specific amplifier kind of definition.
Yes,
I
because
think
it makes so little sense to all take the same dose when you're all bringing these completely different psyches and neurobiologies to it, and then obviously you're all going to have a different experience.
I
think that's great, and I fully love tripping. I would love to trip with both of you. I think that'd be so fun. But like, I'm specifically, I think like develop it if it's your first time or whatever, because there are so many people who are getting into these. Like, figure out how it works for you. And don't worry so much, don't try to connect to the group think first. I think do you first and then connect to the group think. And I would say the same for artists too. Like, find your perspective and amplify your own narrative and then connect to the broader narrative.
Do you have a lot of conversations with people who have come into tripping for the first time because they've noticed that it's a profitable business sector, and so that's been their kind of pathway in? What's it like for people to come in with that as the doorway to kind of the world of tripping as opposed to kind of juvenile experiences?
Great question. And I see it a lot, honestly. And it's one that I have a tough time navigating because I kind of like everyone, I'm just sort of like I've been called a golden retriever before, where they're like, you're just like affable. So I like everyone. But I think that there's an issue I've seen where people just get into tripping. They just have their first experience. And then we're conditioned because they come from like an entrepreneurial background or, they see the opportunity to become this stakeholder, thought leader, business person. And I think like it's not a great move to do that when you're in your honeymoon phase. Like if you feel called to do that, great. But like, I have to be real with you. And I think that like, this is witchcraft. I say that, like, I think there's this sense for people to be like, mushrooms are so happy and fluffy. It's like, yeah, but there's also like a much broader, darker side to them. And I don't think that gets discussed very often. So I just think that like, it's good to know these things, in advance. And that's just something that concerns me a little bit when like people get so gung ho on this thing. And you're like, there are people writing legislation in the United States right now who are actively involved in writing laws in states who may have never had a psychedelic experience before, or maybe had their first mushroom trip in like 2019. And to me, that's very strange to be like, this is a really powerful, special, in my opinion, and many others, sentient substance. Why do you feel like you have to treat it like it's, any other substance? Like maybe, I often say like, do a full send, do a full solo macro dose. If you're going to become a business person or a thought leader, you better know the full spectrum of potential effects here and not just, oh, I did half a gram and I thought it was lovely. So let me determine how people can access these for the rest of the future. Like what?
Yeah, no, I certainly traumatized a few people in my like honeymoon phase of being like, oh my God, this
Same.
all right. And then like learned after like maybe 4 or 5 people like, oh, this is really, but, and then just the idea of someone being platformed and having this audience, and they may do that to huge numbers of people.
I just have to share that, like, I think that they're amazing. Obviously, I'm an unabashed proponent and advocate for them, but also, like, I have a good friend who I asked him, I was like, have you ever tried mushrooms before? And his first time, he got naked and punched a cop in the face. Like, there's wild fucking stories out there. And, it's maybe the exception to the rule, but I just think it's good to know, like, certain people probably shouldn't try these things. And like, you should, absolutely not eat a 3-gram mushroom chocolate for your first time out at a concert. Maybe it'll work for most people, but I think that that's where the education comes in. And that's where I think that we need to have education before any of this industry or regulations. Like, educate people about it. Like, take a half-eighth your first time. That's fine. Maybe it'll be a little bit intense, but you'll be fine. Do not take 7 grams your first time in public. Terrible idea, no matter who you are. And I think that, simple things like that, harm reduction is really valuable.
Why do you think mushrooms have such a strong association with this kind of trickster, like funny, like kooky kind of thing?
They've got them in them. And I don't really have a claim to understand how they work or what they do. I do know that if you eat mushrooms, you'll see some weird shit. You'll feel weird. That's for sure. You can bank on that. But I will give you a quick story that I spent a lot of time in Mexico. We're both in Mexico right now. And in 2010, I was in Oaxaca and went to Maria Sabina's family homestead and spent a couple of nights there. And then I went back in 2021. And the second time I went back, I had some mushrooms. They did a velada for me where they're burning the copal and they're chanting. And it's this really kind of sacrosanct, hallowed grounds. And I wasn't really breaking through. And I was just like, oh man, I came all the way out here. What did I do wrong? And then I started thinking of funny jokes, and the mushrooms just started hitting me with plot lines, left, right, center. So I think there is like real value there where I realized I was like, oh, this is funny to them. Like, I think that there is this sense of like, don't take yourself too seriously. Life could be anything you want it to be. And if you can develop that sense of humor, it's almost like this bulletproof vest or, invincible shield from the sky. If you could develop a sense of humor. Have you ever realized, like, if as an artist, like if someone's critical towards you or they write a mean comment, you get defensive. Well, when you develop a sense of humor, you're just like, that's hilarious, whatever. Like, maybe I am a goofball, it's like this incredible permission to just not care about a lot of the things that happen. I think that's really valuable, especially today.
Well, they're usually kind of right as well. There's usually any criticism I've received, I'm usually like, kind of.
Yes, and I think also the ability to approach it with humor often comes from being able to acknowledge it on some level and kind of absorb that acknowledgement into your self-understanding as well.
Yeah, just don't take things personally. I think that it's like, that's what humor is good for. It's just like, we're all trying to figure it out. And like, but I also like to qualify this with saying, I don't take everything as a joke. Like, but, I just think you can cultivate a sense of humor. And it's in short supply right now because we're constantly getting bombarded with bewildering and sad news and atrocious things that have happened. It's like, nobody is meant to shoulder all that. Like, you have to be able to just say, I've had enough of that. I'm going to laugh for a little bit.
Just to go back to, I really liked what you said just now about the mushrooms being sentient beings, and just wondering about all of the businesses that you discover and kind of bring into people's consciousness through your show. Which businesses do you feel kind of represent the sentience and the character of the mushrooms best?
Yeah, it's tricky because my show encompasses all mushrooms. So, for example, I think that anybody working with mycomaterials is doing amazing work. It's just showing like what mushrooms can do that most people wouldn't have considered, that you can make shoes and hats and things like that out of mushrooms at scale too. So that's really cool. I've had a number of different entrepreneurs like Efrain Robledo, shout out. He's a professor in Mexico, in Monterrey, and he's doing mushroom leather. So that's one that comes to mind. But as far as psychedelics in particular, I've had a bunch of like biotech people on, and part of that I think is like, I want to genuinely learn what they're up to just outside of a press release. Like, what are you guys doing? Like, you got a license to grow mushrooms from Health Canada or whatever, and you're a biotech firm. Like, what's the goal here? I just think it's valuable to like build those relationships and kind of understand what's going on. So yeah, another one that comes to mind is Namex. They're based in Vancouver in Canada, and I just had Jeff Chilton, who's the founder, for the second time on the podcast. And like, I think they're doing everything right. Like, they are a beacon of shining light that people should aspire to. And that's who I'm trying to platform, people like that. Like, He's been a mushroom farmer for 50 years. He was a hippie in the 70s, and now he's fully got his shit together. Not to say that hippies can't have their shit together, but like, I think there's something really valuable. And like, he was a hippie, you know, down in Oaxaca studying. His major was anthropology. So he was studying traditional mushroom use, growing mushrooms, et cetera, and then went on to found a super successful business and pioneer an entire industry. And I think that's really cool. That's what I would call integration. And, you know, still doing it. And the proof's in the pudding. Dude is super sharp. You know, he's got to be in his mid 70s now, sharp as a tack, lucid, traveling the world, get paid. Awesome. So shout out Namex and that whole umbrella that they've got a number of other companies operating around them as well, like Real Mushrooms, so on and so forth. And man, I really like the trickster energy that I saw at Breaking Convention. I don't know how many of the people I've had on my podcast. I've had Darren a few times. Darren Springer, Darren LeBaron, quintessential mushroom trickster, you know, just an incredible human being. And so I think yes, I think so. And Mudu Vaki too, if you all know him, great dude. And Acacia Lewis, I could go on and on.
I just realized that you can put Myco in front of everything and it just sounds really whimsical. Myco hidden.
Exactly.
It's some Myco shoes.
Myco shoes. Yeah. Mycopreneur is kind of a misnomer. It is a very like bro-y Silicon Valley name. It had good Google domain authority, I think it was. It's like, I thought it was, and I have a number of reasons I chose it, but it is kind of like a misnomer. I think a lot of people have expressed like, what a dumb name. And then they actually see the satire and they're like, oh, that was a good one. Like you kind of snuck in the back door with that one.
Yeah, I was asking you because I was like, can I ask if that name was serious or is that mean?
Nothing's out of bounds here. Yeah. No, it was actually quite amazing how quickly the project took off, I have to say. Like, I think a lot of it was that I have a background in psychedelics and in media. So like, I haven't had to fake any of this, which has been really refreshing because I do feel like there are a lot of people who kind of trying, you know, they're like trying to be media and psychedelic people. So I can say for once in my life, like I'm actually on top of this shit, you know, like this is what I've been doing, you know, for years. It feels really good. No, like I did psychedelics because I was weird. Like I didn't fit into the status quo, right? It's like I felt weird. And when I discovered art and artists that I connected with and psychedelics, it was okay to be weird. My weirdness is what made me special. I'm special, you know? So I think that's like what I want I don't want psychedelics to lose weirdness. I think that a lot of people getting in and trying to make money off it, they're literally trying to like mitigate and marginalize and ostracize the element of weirdness. And okay, I suppose if you're trying to make it more relatable and palatable to millions or tens of millions of people, but like, what if that weirdness is what makes them special and what makes this whole experience work? Why would we ever sterilize that and sanitize it away?
Or put a dress code on a conference.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask before I forget. I wondered if you'd be potentially willing to collaborate with us on something. And you probably don't know about this because I think it only happens to women, which is if you mention as a woman that you work in psychedelics, it's quite common for whoever you're talking to go, have you ever heard of DMT? They're like, yeah, I work in it. And then they tell you in great detail what it is. And I've seen it with Roz, and Roz is like, yeah, no, I was actually in that study that you're mentioning. Yeah. So anyway, what happens is, it's incredible. It's incredible.
And it usually follows, oh, you're writing. What are you writing? And then you kind of have to stop writing in order to be told what DMT is.
Mansplaining microdosing. That's a good plot line.
Particularly DMT. It's really, really weird.
But yeah, we'd like to collect together instances of this in some kind of form or some kind of database, or just maybe do a bit more canvassing,
or recreate it. We could sort of dramatize it.
I could go with that plot line all day. Like, I am that person. You mentioned this earlier briefly, Rianne. Like, I'm so glad I did try to start a company or a podcast or a platform in my honeymoon phase with psychedelics. So especially like the mansplaining, there's just something I think that when you have a psychedelic, you feel like you understand something that's special. You want to have power over people by like explaining to them, by like, I know how this works, listen to me. So, but that's quite humiliating for the person who's mansplaining, you know, and it's a cultural thing. So on behalf of the male species, I apologize for anybody who may have done that to you recently. Well, you have more experience than I would, like the academic community, I think. Like I'm relatively new. I've not been in any studies or anything like this, but I just joined Twitter and I've noticed a fuck ton of these like, you know, kind of intelligent nerds, let's call them, who, you know, want to explain things, it feels like. And you're just like, that, I don't know, man. There's a very decidedly non-psychedelic energy to that, I think. Like I actually fell asleep at a academic psychedelic conference lecture about psilocybin. And like, to me, it's time to spice it up a little bit if we're putting people in the audience who are actual trippers to sleep while we're talking about the non-binding serotonin and this and that. Like, great. I do think there's value, of course. I'm not so hubristic to suggest that's not important. But like, could you take a public speaking class, please? Or like, you know, have one joke that you insert at the beginning of the lecture? That's my take.
Well. So it's kind of like how much can you really understand by describing what's happening in the brain? It's a bit hubristic to assume.
It's hubristic for sure. Okay. Yeah, most people are gonna encounter psychedelics through art and through pop culture, and like this idea that clinical psychedelics is this next big thing. It's like they've actually contributed towards creating a demand that they cannot actively fill. All of these media companies and industry people who are trying to, you know, amplify this narrative about how exciting psychedelics are, but like basically no one can legally access them. All they're doing is driving the gray or black market or the legacy market gangbusters, and that's the facts.
That's so true. And then there's so little positive media coverage still of the non-medical side of it. So that's all still kind of in this weird underground. But we should probably wrap up fairly soon because your dog has gone silent.
And we're going to talk tomorrow on my podcast, so we can continue this.
Yeah, that will be our first podcast that we haven't hosted. So we're excited. I think it is. Yeah, it's our first time that we've been on someone else's podcast.
Well, I'm honored. I'll dress up. I'll wear like a bow tie and comb my hair. It'll be nice. Yeah.
Maybe we should do that too.
Great.
No.
But I just have, like, Rianne might have a last question as well, but I just have one last one, which is you commented after BC about how you came away finally able to understand the weird European fascination with psytrance music. Please, can you share some insights with us about that? And did the mushrooms have...
Definitely. And I'm going to Hungary this week. I don't know if I mentioned that. I'm going to Ozora, which is a psytrance festival. So I feel like I'm going to be fully immersed. And that'll set off a chain of festivals. I'm going to like 3. I'm going to be in England for one called Camp Out, and then Ceylon Festival in the Netherlands. So it's just like, I'm going to keep going and learning because it's fun. But I guess what I understood about it is that it is its own subculture. It is its own universe that's existing in spite of whatever's popular or on the airwaves or top 40 right now. And I feel like the festival scene, at least the popular ones in the United States, are geared more towards like the big pop artists and the headlining artists and all that. Like there certainly are underground festivals, but I don't know that we have anything as like meritocratic or like as, you know, community based as psytrance, which is huge, like Boom Festival. And, you know, of course we have Burning Man, but I feel like Europe has a really robust scene. And, you know, I guess just talking to Fluffy and like learning about, you know, I mentioned Aphex Twin. He's like, oh, I met Aphex Twin. Yeah, he was on the bus with us. It's my best Glastonbury. It's pretty good, right? I'm on the water.
Is it your first Azora?
It's my first Azora, and I have no expectations. I'm super pumped. I have no idea what to expect.
Are you speaking at the...
I'm speaking, yes. Literally this week. It's like I'm leaving on Sunday, and then I'm speaking on Tuesday.
But I've done it a few times. It's really great. There's a really great stage at Azora called the Cooking Grove, and it's you wouldn't even notice that it's a stage. It's the smallest one, and it's like an outdoor kitchen, but there's a really good music.
Hell yeah, I'm amazingly stoked.
It's really good. Yeah, well, I guess we'll... Wait, do I have a last question? No. What's your favourite number?
Ooh, 21. Did I just say that because that's what my birthday's on the 21st? Probably. I think so. Yeah. What's your favorite number?
Of what month?
March 21st. It's on the first day of spring. So I'm like a Aries. Are you astrologically inclined?
Both ironically and not ironically.
That's a really
Okay.
good answer, yes. It's impossible to live in Mexico without people asking you what your ascendant is every time you leave the house. So I think we've both kind of ratcheted up our astrological inclinations since we got here.
We're going to have to talk about that tomorrow. That'll be like my first question because I have so many questions about it. Because also, I don't know how things work and I've always been very skeptical of it. But also, I have no idea how things work. And there seem to be a lot of strange things and energies afoot. Maybe that's a framework for understanding them. So we can dive into that. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on your non-podcast. It felt like a podcast, but it was really just a cool conversation. And I'm glad we get to continue it tomorrow and I get to let you talk and learn more about both of you.
Really?
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
It's been amazing.
Hasta mañana.
Cheers. Hasta mañana, señora iguana.